take it away. And
okay.
For those who are not presenting, maybe turn your cameras off during the presentation.
All right, thank you, Steven. I hope everybody can hear me okay. And thank you for that introduction. So I will go right into what we have with our research, because we have a lot to cover, and I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible with a lot of our information here. So developing the current study, we had a broad research question that we came to. And early conversations with Kristi, and then we brought Chris and Pamela into the discussion. You know, we have this broad idea we were working with. What are the perceptions of victim service providers working in an American Midwestern state concerning the mobilization of services and resources for victims since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic? So in our initial plan, we kept it pretty broad. You know, we thought to ourselves, we will look at those who provide services to victims, but also those who are serving offenders in the community and in institutions. For the sake of this stage of the project, we decided to go with looking at those that are providing services to victims. So we built on our previous work related to placing and accessing justice. We were able to do that. And we wanted to use the broad orientation of that previous work. So differences in urban and rural communities, what access to services and resources are there, and then coupling that with elements that shape, you know, criminal justice processes that we already know are established, but then how are they impacted with various measures that had to be put in place or were put in place depending on, you know, the political context at specific times during the past 15 months. So how did the pandemic impact service provision for victims in our largely rural Midwestern state? And looking at not just that impact that it had on providing services, but then what was the impact on that victimization on how the services were provided in the context of the pandemic. So just to contextualize the study a little bit, in case you have not figured out, for those of you who know, and you know, we are friends of those at the University of Winnipeg, we are located in South Dakota, so keeping it general in a Midwestern state in the United States, but looking at the COVID-19 response and pivot, as we've come to call it in academia, 7 states in the United States, Arkansas, Iowa, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, where we're located, Utah, and Wyoming, did not issue stay-at-home orders. You know, and some of those orders were termed differently: safer at home, stay at home. One of the 7 states, which would be the state that we are located in, did not require any businesses to close. However, what's important, it was important for our project, it kind of helped to contextualize some things that we started to look at. Localities could implement their own ordinances. So there was a lot of variation in the state, broadly speaking, but even what we call East River, east of the Missouri River, there was quite a bit of variation. You know, looking, you know, more at contextualizing things, considering the resources in rural states, and South Dakota is a good example of this. You know, the victim service providers, they've got to do more with less. They provide services to larger and often isolated geographic areas. Non-victim specialists, and a lot of times police officers, those working in law enforcement, are going to be the first and only contacts with victims. And those close social ties in rural communities will sometimes make reporting more difficult, whether that's from a response perspective, you know, in the sense of what we have with victims wishing to remain unknown, they remain unknown just because of the social and geographic structures. There's a lot of things that come into play there to create this particular contextualizing situation. Doesn't always happen, but we do see that it's a pattern that's there. All right, so with our methodology, we shifted from our original plan. Originally, we had a plan to roll out a survey with all victim service providers, and we realized that was a little too ambitious for the timeline. So what we did is we shifted to conducting depth interviews with key informants. So again, kind of diving into what's going on with key informants and how valuable they are. They can provide insight into their organization because they've got this firsthand knowledge, institutional knowledge that goes back several years. They have a very intimate familiarity with what it is that we're studying, and related to what it is that we're specifically looking at with the COVID-19 pandemic, they're intimately familiar with what their agency and services they provided, how they were intricately tied into various things that needed to occur because we had this pivot. And keeping on this idea of understanding what the key informant interview can really give us and how we go about doing it, it's a loosely structured conversation. We had a broad set of questions, which I will go over those in just a moment, but they guided us. It was a guided conversation. It wasn't exclusively limited to that, but very open-ended. It allowed them to talk very, I don't want to say casually, but it was definitely very open, and I kind of let the key informant drive the conversation. Our current number of key informant interviews is 5. We've completed 5 interviews. We plan to do more. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But of course, that key informant is going to give us that breadth of knowledge, allows us to see if there's some themes. And we do see some themes sometimes, even if the informants are coming from different types of settings. And it can inform us as to what the next step should be. We used a snowball sampling approach. We asked each informant to recommend individuals to contact next as potential respondents. And again, we then got a firm grasp kind of what this network is as to who's knowledgeable about this subject, who's best to talk to. When we reached out to the next informant, it allowed us to build that rapport that this person recommended you. Would you be willing to talk to us? Give us an hour of your time via Zoom. We can record the conversation if you're comfortable, if your agency allows it, and that's how we approached it. And so the nice thing is myself as a researcher, I have knowledge and connection to the South Dakota Network on Family Violence and Sexual Assault. That's out of Sioux Falls. And I will henceforth refer to them as the network. But my work with training victim advocates in a statewide steering committee, the network is charged with providing funding for those initiatives. So my first point of contact was with somebody at the network. And so having that connection really allowed us to efficiently jump into this research. And another important thing to note about the network is since the onset of the pandemic, they've hosted bi-weekly Zoom calls to allow member agencies. Now, the member agencies could be community shelters, domestic violence shelters, homeless shelters, any agencies that are a member of the network, they could call in and they did it every other Monday, so it's bi-weekly, checking in, sharing ideas, kind of getting information out there. And that's something that we learned in some of this data that we collected is how helpful those bi-weekly calls were. They also provided training via Zoom. And some of what we found with our findings is that trainings via Zoom were kind of there was a love-hate relationship with that. And I'll explain a little bit more about that as well. All right, so describing our 5 respondents, 1 employee, and this was the first person I reached out to contact, was 1 employee of the network. And the network does serve both what we call community-based agencies, and those are our shelters, homeless shelters. It could be domestic violence, predominantly domestic violence, and other types of community-based provision that we see, typically nonprofit funding. And then we have service providers that are system-based. So we call these our victim witness specialists. And they also serve those particular providers by providing information and training as well. We had 3 shelter directors that were respondents. 1 would be considered urban, 2 would be considered rural. And those are community-based, of course. And then we had 1 victim witness specialist, and this person was system-based because they work for Division of Criminal Investigation, and they are under the direct auspices of the Attorney General of South Dakota. All right, so we asked questions of the key informants, and as I noted, this is not exhaustive. It wasn't limited to this. We allowed the conversations to go in directions that the key informants felt was prescient, important to note. Have you and your colleagues adapted during the pandemic? How have you done this? What have you employed? And that question was pretty broad. Sometimes it allowed them to talk a little bit about what they did right after we pivoted, you know, March, April, May of 2020, how some of those things have become common for them. They're now comfortable with them. What they did initially, maybe just for a couple of weeks, but then they quickly realized this isn't going to work. So that was really the key question, and the question that I would say the respondents spent the most time discussing. What types of victimization did the victims you work with experience during the pandemic? And did you access training or technical assistance during, and that should be during the pandemic, not during the training, I apologize, but it should be during the pandemic. So pardon me for that misplaced word. All right, so getting into what really is what I would call the fun part of what it is that we did, and really being able to look at what was rewarding about this study. As I communicated with my colleagues, each time I would conduct an interview, I would get more and more excited because I would say, you know, it's really exciting to talk to these folks, what they offered. I'm seeing some patterns, what it is that they're able to share with us. It's, you know, and each and every one of them, I'm going to go ahead and say this now, at the end of every interview, they all thanked me and said, this in many ways has allowed me to collect my thoughts about the past 15 months. But the last person that I talked to, and you know, the 5 that I've already talked to, was the victim witness specialist. And she stated this, and it was so profound to me that I thought I'm going to make sure that this is noted when we're discussing our findings, because I want us to all to keep this in mind when we're looking at these findings. She said, these are challenging and creative times. She said that in the very beginning. She concluded with it. And in the conclusion, you know, kind of bringing it back, you know, it allowed me to kind of see things in the way that all of these respondents were viewing things. So a lot of themes were coming out as I talked to each of these. So each of these respondents, I should say. So the challenge was the fact that the work of service providers had to continue. I mean, those of us that are academics, we pivoted, we shifted, we came off campus, we were teaching remotely. And then there's, you know, a lot of people in our lives that we're familiar with the work that they do, they were able to work remotely. Victim service providers weren't able to stop what they were doing. They had to meet the challenge. The work had to carry on. So some themes that came out is that the network resources were utilized. They did the trainings on Zoom. As I said, it was noted that was a blessing and a curse, pro and con. There was that love-hate relationship. What everybody liked about it is we could do more training. What we didn't like about it is, now we've lost that kind of one-on-one contact with the people that we can meet in training. So there's been some benefit, but then there's also been some drawback. A lot of what we would see in terms of the biweekly Zoom check-ins. There was one respondent that would always participate. A couple respondents would do it when their schedule permitted. No matter how often they were able to do it, they felt like the check-ins allowed them to be informed. And here's a quote that one offered. It allowed her to keep in touch with the broader picture and realize she wasn't alone. Another thing that she noted, I got the policy updates on COVID-19 and information about vaccine rollout that I could relay to the victims that I was serving. The rural service providers noted that the abuse victims experienced more intense abuse, and some of those threats of violence involved lethality. Whereas in the past, it might have been some verbal abuse, calling somebody, I have 1 minute left, okay. I've never actually accessed the chat when I'm sharing my screen. Okay, I'll make this really quick because this is the really good stuff. The lethality with the violence, the economic abuse was reported more, looking at things related to economic stimulus money that was issued in the states. Sometimes they didn't have access to that. The partner was holding on to it. The urban service provider didn't see a significant change in the nature of abuse. The urban service provider also noted that what we had in that particular jurisdiction is they did not have any mandates. So while they had to adapt and do some things related to cleaning, sterilization, we didn't necessarily see that those that were served had to adapt because those mandates weren't there. All right, courthouses, auxiliary services such as child visitation centers were not open at the beginning of the pandemic. Personal protective equipment distributed to victims, not required to use it because here in our state, again, we didn't have these mandates. But each respondent noted that new sanitization procedures are put in place and they've continued to do this. A good example is with the urban service provider, and they have the child visitation center. They've now taken Rubbermaid totes that they sterilize, put toys in those children, and choose those, they clean them at the end of the day. And she said, we'll continue to do that even when the pandemic subsides to a state where we feel comfortable. All right, I'm gonna try to quickly get through this. Any outreach or program development was put on pause. Sexual assault response team is a good example of that. One provider in the rural area, we saw that things dried up initially. And this person questioned, was law enforcement not getting calls? Or are they not making arrests? Were they afraid that if we're actually moving people from one location into the jail, there might be this potential for COVID-19 to spread there? We don't want it there. What we saw with the victim witness specialist, this person said, initially, what we saw at that shift, the initial appearances, the victims chose not to go. She would go on their behalf. Now we're seeing now that the courthouses are opening up, again, they're going back to that. They're getting more comfortable going to court. We had a backlog with cases prior to the pandemic. That backlog is only getting greater. And one thing that was noted was that time is up, please wrap up. Okay, thank you, I will do that. One thing was noted is that there's this fear that there may be more frustration with victims when we continue to see more of a backlog develop. All right, here's the creative part. Everybody had to be creative. Speaking through home windows, conducting meetings on Zoom. However, one respondent said we didn't want to use Zoom because we were getting all this information that Zoom wasn't very secure. The victim witness specialist said, I did everything in my vehicle. I was double masked and double gloved. She's actually become quite the, she's been quite a good resource, for me in my teaching of victimology. And so she's become a friend, but she said, I was the one that created double masking before everybody was doing it in the news in 2021, January 2021. All right, so concluding, didn't stop any services, had to be creative, patience, perseverance, and creativity. Again, and one thing that was noted by all of them, but specifically the victim witness specialist, It's brought out the best in those that provide services to victims, had to be honest and transparent. I will say what was refreshing for us is what we're dealing with is oftentimes macabre, and it's disappointing to communities, and how do we handle it? It's negative, but they all felt reinvigorated and positive about what it is that they're doing. We're going to continue with the key informant interviews, and then we do want to take what we gather with this information and construct a survey, roll it out to all victim service providers in the state. So that would be the advocates at the shelters working with the directors of the shelter. And can we discern any patterns? Are there gaps in services? Are there gaps in resources? This is what really matters. I mean, what we're doing is, sure, it's interesting, we're able to see some patterns, but what can we do with this knowledge? And that's all we have for you.
All right, thank you very much. I am going to just very quickly pivot to our next paper. I'm going to use that term pivot. Alan McGreevy from the University. As usual, your paper has inspired a great deal of fear in me about our future. But thank you, very interesting topic. So very quickly, I will turn things over to Michael Weinrath, who will be presenting on behalf of Braeden Broschuk and himself, evaluating the mobilization of restorative justice. Please go ahead, Mike.
Okay, thank you, Steven. Yeah. No. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about restorative justice. So just before I begin, I just quickly like to thank my colleague, Braeden Broschuk. Braeden couldn't be with us today. He's currently training for the Winnipeg Police Service, started this research prior to applying and was successful in his application. Wanted to thank the Manitoba Law Foundation for providing the bulk of funding for this particular research, and the Winnipeg Police Service, who were actually very generous in allowing access to data and were receptive to recommendations emanating from this particular study. Okay, so when we look at restorative justice, it's become something that's been promoted federally as well as provincially, right? It's seen as an alternative to the traditional justice system. And so we're starting to see more of those programs across the country, and we'll look at a program that today that was operated in Winnipeg's North End. And so Winnipeg's North End is a low-income, high crime area. So it's a very interesting place, I think, to operate a restorative justice diversion pilot. Yeah, when people look at restorative justice, and we're looking at the decision to refer or not to refer, right? A lot of the research tends to focus on police. So our research differs a little bit. We're interested in police referral, but also Crown referral, because in the program in Manitoba, you can refer at the police level, or you can refer pre-charge, and you can do the post-charge with respect to Crown referral. So that's something that I think distinguishes our research. I'd also mention, though, that I use the term diversion because we're not actually looking at RJ programs themselves, although RJ was a big driver of this particular pilot, because not everyone who gets diverted necessarily goes to restorative justice. Okay, but yeah, our interest today really is how well utilized the program is. Okay, so when we look at restorative justice, you know, typically we look at mediation, we look at referral away from the traditional justice system. One of the things that has given RJ a bit of cachet and a bit of interest from a number of different groups is its connection with Indigenous justice and forms of Indigenous justice. Okay, so again, we try to make these referrals before the first appearance. Generally, there's a mediator and a decision to outcome, usually apology work service or some sort of referral. And again, in the Winnipeg pilot, there was Anishinaabe was an Indigenous agency involved in delivering some of the service. So again, this idea of mediation, reconciliation, accountability. Okay, theoretical underpinnings. So RJ tends to be associated with this theory of reintegrative shaming that's put forth by Braithwaite. And so the idea that you are accountable for a particular crime, but that you, so that you are shamed, but that there's reintegration, that with acceptance of responsibility, there comes a welcoming back into the community. And again, very consistent with a lot of the ideas in restorative justice. Labeling theory, which goes back to the 50s, 60s, is actually affiliated with diversion and to a significant degree also with restorative justice. And that's the idea that you try to have people avoid being charged, processed through the criminal justice system and getting this identity, self-identity as a offender. And it's significant in the sense that it has implications for how you want to operate that program or what's an optimal operation. And so in that sense, then what you want to do is you want to make sure that the police are the point of referral, right? That you don't actually do the post-charge processing through the court and then finally diverting someone, although that system exists, right? We have police, right, and sort of pre-charge, and then the prosecutors in more of a post-charge. Okay, so there's a number of barriers to RGA referral. So that might include things such as the police interest in crime fighting, right? That they don't actually see themselves as involved in sort of the social work assessment process. More recently in Canada and elsewhere, zero tolerance for certain types of bail or probation violations. And for police, if they don't divert, right, then it's up to the Crown. And then if something goes wrong later and the person reoffends, then they're not responsible. So there's a certain incentive for police not to refer. Yeah, so adapting RJ then is not maybe as easy as we think. And then our big research question, how well is it being utilized in Manitoba? So the current study, so again, we're looking at a pilot program that was connected to some RJ services, so providing more resources. And so the study was run in the North End. We looked at charges over a 6-month period. So we looked at everyone who was charged by Division 13 in the North End, all the crimes. So again, it's sort of a different type of approach than you might see in just an evaluation of a single program. So it was official records collection. So we collected data from police files. So we had significant access to current offense data and prior offense data. So the research, so boiling it down to 3 research questions. We wanted to know actually how many offenders out of the total, right? Like if RJ is going to have this big impact on the justice system, like what is the proportion? What's the number that are being referred? And then how about people who weren't being referred, who might meet the criteria? And also then, is there potential to increase the use of diversion, restorative justice, if we want to see it as a significant, having a significant impact? Okay. So again, the WPS criteria, serious crimes are restricted, but there's a number of crimes that you'd be surprised would be included. Prior criminal history of violence actually did not have to be taken into account by the police or the Crown. Yeah, so again, if you look at a particular offense, that's really the big distinguishing point. I'll talk about some of those offenses in a moment. Also, of course, the accused has to accept responsibility, sort of be willing to plead guilty. They have the option to have charges dealt with in court. They may not want to participate in programming. And there may not even be enough evidence to proceed with prosecution. For the police, they have to get their supervisors to approve. Okay, so let's take a look at the sample. So again, you mostly have younger, single, unemployed males. This is fairly typical to probation or prison populations. If we look at the ethnicity, you have about 64% are Indigenous, which is an overrepresentation. In this particular area of the city, though, they do represent about 30% of the population, according to the census. Okay, so again, their background. So again, there are some very serious criminal backgrounds noted. But interestingly, there are a lot of people who are first offenders who've been arrested, and a lot of people who don't have very many prior offenses or have no or very little violence. So actually a lot of potential to refer individuals. So again, the types of offenses, just quickly, a couple of things of interest. Yeah, so again, about 25% are violent, but a number would be assaults, which have potential to be referred, a number of property offenses, and less serious property offenses. So there's quite a few. Driving offenses, things like drunk driving, impaired driving are not eligible. And again, interestingly, a lot of offenses are breaches, 23.3. And so that certainly is an area that has potential greater use. So again, if you look at all the eligible offenses, there are about 1,000 offenses out of 1,453 that the Crown or police theoretically could divert, right? So again, about 45.6 are police, right? Police eligible, and about 23% would be Crown eligible. Okay, so others are either impaired driving or serious. So what do we see? Well, if we look at all 1,453, we see about 10% are diverted. We actually see many more from the Crown than from the police. If we look at just the 1,000 that are eligible, we have about 15%, and again, about twice as many from the Crown as the police. We set up a couple of groups looking at really low risk and then looking at moderate risk. I'm just going to go through this quickly so we can wrap up and have some time for questions, I guess. So again, in the lower group, the lowest risk group, about half were diverted, right? It's probably the simple, so no prior outstanding charges. Again, more of those by the police. But, you know, my question is, what about all these other low risk cases? Like, why weren't they diverted? Telling me everybody decided they didn't want to do restorative justice. Yeah, as soon as you get up to a higher risk group, suddenly you're seeing a much greater likelihood to for the Crown to actually have to do that diversion and a greater overall reluctance. So anyway, so again, I would suggest no prior violence, not that many priors, that they would be good potential for diversion. I don't have time. There were actually a number of higher risk cases that were referred by the police and the Crown. And again, there is some potential and there's some activity with more serious cases, but not really very consistent. Okay, so just to conclude then quickly, so it's a significant shift. If you want to do restorative justice or even use diversion in a more significant way, I mean, it's a significant shift in criminal justice practices. So again, we see 15% of eligible cases. Some people might say, well, that's pretty good for a pilot, but it really falls short of any sort of a dramatic shift in practice. And the deferral by the police to the Crown is troubling. You're starting to see people go through the system, which theoretically, again, you know, you prefer for the police to be the gatekeepers and keep people out of the system. And so we like to see, we recommended more activity by the supervisors, putting more onus on patrol officers to refer, more activity by police and Crown generally. Defense counsel, I think, can advocate, at least in the post-charge stage. And finally, breach for cognizant probation, and actually an area perhaps to explore more. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to all our panelists. We have about 4 minutes left for questions, so we are running a little bit behind schedule, but there still are some a few moments for some questions. So if folks would like to take a few moments and either type it into the Q&A, or if you are a panelist, you can certainly put it in the chat, or even turn your camera on and ask it verbally. But I wondered if maybe I could start by I had a couple of questions come to mind during the first presentation by Courtney Waid and her colleagues. You mentioned, of course, that your state was one of several that did not have a statewide lockdown mandate.
Right.
And I know in other jurisdictions that significant, the lockdown itself changed the nature of crime and how the dynamics of crime took place. I wondered if that was reflected at all in the experiences of the service providers that you talked about, or because your state didn't have the consistent lockdown, was the crime picture significantly different than before COVID-19?
That's a good question. So because of what we had here in South Dakota, we were able, and based on who I talked to, we're already able to discern a little bit of a pattern. What we had in jurisdictions where there were some mandates where those localities chose to say businesses are to shut down, certain types of businesses, or they recommended people stay at home, or they implemented a mask mandate, although it wasn't enforced. Those are the jurisdictions where they noted that the violence, the threat of violence entailed more lethality. Now, in the urban area, or more urban area, I should say, and it was one area as compared to similar areas in the eastern part of the state that did not have any recommendations or mandates. Interestingly, this person said we were not seeing any differences. We operated at the same capacity that we did in late summer, and they're typically full late summer, but we did not see an influx of individuals. And as we know, the way we measure crime, obviously with victimization, it is one measure. So and that's why, and Steven, that's a good question. I think that's why it will be important for us to expand and include law enforcement, first responders, things, various entities of that nature to get a broader and more complete picture.
Thank you. I see a few questions have popped up for Michael's presentation. So maybe I'll start first with a question from Sarah. How receptive was the WPS and the Crown's office to the evaluation findings?
And well, the report actually has only been out for a few weeks, to be fair, although we've had some back and forth with the police with respect to some of Braeden's other work. But to answer your question more directly, yeah, the police actually have tried to mobilize and get the message out to the supervisors that, yeah, they are accountable and they have to provide some evidence that they're using restorative justice. And Braeden actually mentioned in his police training that they actually did a long session on restorative justice and seemed to be very serious in improving its use. So the report actually had come out, but we had actually communicated a lot of these things and some of the other stuff. The Crown, I have not actually heard back from, and yeah, we'll see actually how that turns out. So anyway, that's the honest answer. But the Crown were actually, they were reasonably good. You actually have to make a court application, by the way, for anybody who wants to do restorative justice. You actually have to apply to the court to get access to it. It's in the criminal code. Very, very unusual, but an interesting provision. Costs money though. Lawyers are not free.
Thank you, Michael. And I realize we're just over time, but I wanted just one quick question for Alan. And then I know there are some questions in the chat, and perhaps folks can hang back and Michael might address those during the coffee break. But Alan, you mentioned, I think, to close your discussion that trust is essential to resolving some of these